In this episode, I am once again joined by Mattias Daly, Taoist practitioner and translator of Taoist Inner Alchemy, published by Shambala. Mattias reflects on lessons learned from the series of exorcisms he underwent in his 20s, as described in episode 263 of this podcast, including the means entities may gain entry and the surprising motives for their doing so. Mattias explains the vast hierarchy of spiritual beings described in Taoism, considers the problems of obtaining special powers through relationships with entities and gods, and contrasts deity worship with voluntary shamanistic possession. Mattias also reflects on different types of Taoist practices, drawing a distinction between cataphatic and kenotic approaches, and recounts a remarkable story of spiritual healing. So, without further ado, Mattias Daly. Mattias Daly, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm so pleased to be talking with you again, and wow, we've had quite a trio of episodes about your life, about Taoism, and the practices of Taoism and how they've changed over the centuries and taken so many different forms. And the most recent episode, an account of your entity possession in New Zealand, absolutely mind-blowing. And we wanted to start, we were discussing before we began, with an addendum to that third episode to do with entities and the implications of relating with entities in terms of the powers. So I'm wondering if you might pick up on that addendum for us.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. To be honest, I don't remember exactly how I thought, oh, we should have this addendum at the time, but it just struck me that given that I spent so much of the last time we spoke sharing this story about an entity, which, despite the fact that I have no ability to personally identify and sense it, but certainly whatever was happening changed my life dramatically and opened my eyes to a massive number of different possibilities. And one of the things I learned from that was that many different spiritual traditions, maybe most, acknowledge the existence of various types of entities. And in the years after I left New Zealand and spent a decade in China and now over 6 years in Taiwan, I've, of course, encountered many discussions of entities in Taoist and Buddhist contexts, as well as Chinese medicine context, actually. They're always a little bit different. But I thought, since I personally primarily practice teachings given to me by my Taoist teachers, and my academic research also is most closely revolving around Taoism, although I also research Buddhism and Chinese medicine still, I thought maybe it'd be a nice way to share some of what, for instance, Abbess Liu, who I've mentioned in previous episodes, the Quanzhen nun, who is the abbess of a monastery in Jilin province in northern China, northeastern China, had said about entities, and then other things that I've observed and heard and seen over the years. Okay, I guess now I recall the reason that everything that I had sent, that I thought there might be more to add. I think in the last episode I spoke a bit during this strange period of time between leaving Chicago, traveling through Europe, and going to New Zealand. I talked about having this experience on a train where a woman was sitting across from me, right? And I went into either a self-deluded fantasy state or a state of altered perception, and I sensed that in her knuckles was an accumulation of some sort of gunk-like gray sticky substance, and that using my own mind, I was able to remove this, and that as I finished this, and the whole time I had been staring intently at her hands, I looked up at this woman, and she was staring at me just directly into my eyes with tears pouring down her face, and a look of, it seemed to me that she felt something happening. It didn't seem just like a person crying for no reason or for a reason with nothing to do with me. I mean, she was tears streaming down her face. And I kind of regretted not returning to that story, because I think a lot of people desire powers, including powers for good. And at that time in my life, I certainly did. I was on the path towards moving towards studying Chinese medicine. I already knew that I wanted to do that. And I had read books like Chronicles of Tao and Open the Dragon Gate and Paramahansa's book. And my mind was very open to the possibility that, well, it would be sure nice for me to have some superpowers too. I might have told myself only for good, of course. And in all honesty, I never sat around and fantasized about like doing some Emperor Palpatine stuff. But, once you get into spiritual communities, I think you often will encounter warnings about desires for powers, including benevolent powers. I mean, the desire itself can be very derailing, very time-wasting. It may lead to nowhere at all. I personally tend to think 9.9 times out of 10, it leads nowhere. And whatever percentage of the time somebody may develop a so-called siddhi, or supernormal power, or what have you, the warnings in the spiritual world tend to be that's not always a good thing. And to connect that specifically to Taoist oral teachings I've encountered from more than one teacher, note that what I hoped to note when I first brought up that story in France was not that I have magical healing powers, but rather this happened to occur in that period of my life where I was possibly already afflicted by what was removed from me in New Zealand, and also possessed of a wish to develop unusual abilities. And so something that in conversations I've had with Abbess Liu, who is again a Chenzen nun and also a practitioner of Neidan, and a ritual, she leads rituals as well, Chenzen rituals. She has made the point many times that when these sorts of things happen, it is extremely important to just let them come and go, and certainly not to seek them and not to get attached to them and not view them as one's own ability necessarily, or as something special or to be desired, because there are sort of, in this lore, you hear it from quite a few people in China. There's this notion that there are sort of beings without bodies wandering around who will grant abilities to other people. And the reasons can be, or many, really. There's not one sort of simplistic breakdown of what the invisible world might be like, but pitfalls involve, for instance, what might have happened to me in France, a primarily malevolent being sort of granting a wish to sort of stimulate the ego and let one's guard down. That, that's if the interpretation is what happened in France really happened, and that entity that left my body in New Zealand was the source. Another common idea one hears in Chinese spiritual lore is this notion that there are people who accumulated quite a bit of merit and quite a bit of meditative insight and powers of concentration in their life, but due to the functioning of the wheel of reincarnation, they kind of end up stuck on Earth as disembodied beings who, for whatever reason, can't quite qualify or get to what is ever is needed to take another life as a in the flesh being, nor are they quite qualified to ascend. And so one of the things they will do is sort of attach themselves to a person who is open, and then through them help that person perform good deeds so that they themselves can also accrue merit through this process. And then, according to the lore, and I've encountered this in conversation multiple times in Taiwan and China, according to the lore, basically they're trying to get an upgrade and then they can move on with their own path. But the problem that people will say is that, first of all, even if they're primarily benevolent, you're maybe kind of getting into a deal with this being. And then also it's not good for your own ego, especially if you're in a situation where you're not clear that your newfound abilities are the result of what is often referred to as a futi, or an entity that has attached itself to you, or a waiyuan, an external destined relationship. I guess I could try to translate that off the top of my head. Think about that later. A waiyuan, a futi. So that in the Lords, it's often stated, and in teachers speaking to their students, you may not know. You think you now have the ability to sort of occasionally read people's minds or catch glimpses of the future, or, you know, there's a person I've never met, so I'm making no judgment on what he actually does, but I've heard many stories of a fellow in Taiwan who studied Chinese medicine, and then he developed the ability unexpectedly that when he would take the pulse with his fingers on the wrist, he would begin to have glimpses and visions of people's past lives. And apparently he didn't become a Chinese medicine doctor. And I know several people who've gone and seen him. He just sort of became a past life reader, which I personally have no stance on whether that's real or not, and if so, whether or not it's his own ability or if it's something else given to him. But I can say for sure that, for instance, with Abbess Liu, if I called her on the phone, or back when I was still able to visit China, reported a similar thing, and I say this from experience with things that have happened to me, her attitude is just generally, oh, that is quite probably just sort of an interference from the other world, the invisible realm, and don't let it get to your head. Don't get attached to it. It means almost nothing because that's not you. And yeah, so that just kind of like ties up the little anecdote I shared from France last time we spoke.
Is there any room, do you think, in Abbess Liu's view for powers as evidence of attainment, which are, so it's sometimes said, for example, if you reach this level or that level, then you automatically, as sort of part of the deal of that level, get some kind of power, not necessarily guaranteed. I've heard it said, for example, that the presence of a power isn't evidence of attainment, but the absence of a power is evidence of not attainment. There are, of course, Buddhist scriptures that would disagree with that, but nonetheless, I've heard that kind of an idea. And also, Abbess Liu herself, according to your report, has evidenced what could be described as some sort of unusual abilities, seemingly influencing a young man to get his life together when he was sort of depressed and listless and so on. And also you've reported Abbess Liu having received direct teachings from celestial beings, and so on, which seems on the rather supernatural end of things. So,
It is a tricky question. For starters, her own master, Wei Yongcun Daozang, Taoist Wei Yongcun, a monk who I never met. I don't know if I mentioned before that he passed away sitting in meditation. I think in full lotus, and they eventually got, after keeping his mummy in the back room of the monastery for quite a while, a natural mummy, as far as I know, just desiccated on its own and remained seated. And the Chinese government supposedly sent somebody to the monastery. It's like, you can't be just keeping this corpse in your back room. But actually, believe it or not, as atheistic as the Communist Party is on the surface, I can tell you for sure there are plenty of people in the Communist Party who are very religious, very spiritual, superstitious. Some are covering all their bases. And there's a religious administration there, and they made contact with a Buddhist from the mountain, I think in Anhui province, called Jiuhua Shan, who came from a family that had passed down in it the technique for covering a mummified spiritual practitioner's body in gold foil. And he came up to Jilin province, and I've seen video of his visit, and he was interviewed, and he said, this is a very well preserved body, and I believe this represents a high level of attainment. And then they did the work of basically turning his body into a gilded statue, so to speak. And then he's kept in a shrine room from then on with no complaints from the government. And Abbess Liu very much views that phenomenon as evidence of Master Wei's high level of achievement, and that this would have been impossible had he not had profound insight and quite an advanced level of meditation accomplishment. Not necessarily the highest possible, but most of us are not dying seated and mummifying. And furthermore, Abbess Liu has said to me in person that when one is doing a ritual, not that she taught me rituals, but speaking more generally, one must, and she used the term shua, shen tong. Shua is a verb that's actually quite disparaging. It means to kind of show off a bit, yeah, I'll leave it at that, show off a bit, and shen tong being supernormal abilities or siddhis. And she says that, you know, cultivators who should never shua shen tong, and then she says, but at the same time, if you want a ritual to work, you still have to do a little bit of shua shen tong. And my interpretation of this, as best as I can, is she was indicating that the success of a ritual in actually connecting to higher forces is partly it's the sincerity of the people involved. It's the possibly the text itself, the going through the ritual in a certain manner, but then also she was expressing there's also this putting into use one's power, whatever that is. And I did not get a clear explanation of that. But I hasten to add, I really do think from what I've observed that while I did describe in one of the previous episodes some pretty remarkable, you know, lesser miracles being performed, perhaps, for this young man who was ill, I still tend to believe that it was beseeching higher powers for help, which granted them, rather than Abbess Liu or somebody else pointed their finger and shot a lightning bolt from Jilin to Shanghai or anything of that sort. And her humility and her emphasis on the need to do rituals, which are just all about entreating the celestial hierarchy, the celestial pantheon as envisioned by Taoism to intercede, certainly argues against the notion that, at least in her approach to Taoism and that of people like her, that they're relying solely on their own power. It's more of a looking for intercession through prayer, very complicated ritualized prayer. Yeah, I think hopefully that just answered what you said.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You described it as a celestial hierarchy or celestial pantheon. Could you give us a sense of what that is? You've already talked about these masters who, upon death, get kind of caught halfway between and are in a kind of karmic limbo, I suppose, and have to work out a way of topping up their merits sufficiently that they can move on. What are the other kinds of beings that fit in that sort of a category? Ghosts, ancestors, various different spirit lords, and so on. One hears of that sort of thing in Taoism. What are we looking at here when we go into that realm?
I've only been into it intellectually, so I don't even have spiritual dreams. But it's vast. It absorbs basically every deity who's ever left an impact in Chinese folk religious beliefs scattered upon, you know, it's a massive landmass, and many different groups of people were gradually gathered together into what we now call China and what is now known as the Han. And they're obviously not the only ethnicity in China, and there's religious overlaps between some of the other ethnicities who are not Han, plenty of overlap. It's not so syncretic as to say that Taoists, you'll find Padmasambhava referred to as a Taoist deity, or much less perhaps an Egyptian god or Jesus. But nevertheless, it is a very expansive pantheon, and it, to some degree, kind of envisioned or modeled upon the imperial structure of imperial era China, very interestingly. And Well, I'll say it gets boring to me anyway. Probably not the best person to talk to about it. I get a little bit bored thinking about it too much. My last comment, unless you really want to talk about it more, it would kind of be one thing I found very, it brought a smile to my face. Several years ago, I was at a class in Taiwan Normal University with this scholar, Xie Cong Hui, who teaches Taoist literature and history, but he himself is also inducted, I think, into the Zhengyi school to a certain degree. And he does a lot of field work and participant observation. He was just sharing some old texts with us about these certain Taoists, and they have this idea of becoming a Di Xian, or like an earth Xian, an earthbound immortal, and that it's not because they messed up in their cultivation, or they didn't go far enough, or they weren't good enough. It's that they took one look at the heavens, so to speak, and they were like, God, it's just another massive bureaucracy. I don't want to go work for that. And they're like, I'm just going to find a cave on Earth and live there forever until the Earth blows up, till the world blow up, as they say in Chicago. That's an Easter egg. So, yeah, when I heard that story, I was like, I feel those guys. That's about if I ever become a Xian, that's about as far as I want to go. Yeah, don't suck me into the office space of the gods. That sounds miserable.
The office space of the gods.
Oh, and it's like that. You read story after story from ancient times, and there's this term zhexian, a celestial being who has been banished to the earth. And the most common reason is because when they were in the heavens copying some document, they made a transcription error. And for that, you are banished to the earth for however long. And for example, the great poet Li Bai is often fondly referred to as the Zhexian, the banished immortal, the banished Xian. And I think the lower is for him also, that he was having a little too much fun in the heavens and wasn't making those copies accurately enough.
So when somebody like Abbess Liu is petitioning higher beings, celestial beings of various types, how is she selecting which ones to petition?
Abbess Liu does profess to take spiritual journeys. I have heard her speak about that a bit. She doesn't make a huge deal about it. We only spoke about it really in the context of the young man who was desperately ill in an earlier episode. I think that is a factor. For example, even though she is a Taoist, but she has extremely strong affinity with Buddhism, the first ritual that she chose to perform for him was on what they call the birthday on the Buddhist calendar of the Bodhisattva Ksirtigarbha, who is one of the 4 great bodhisattvas of Mahayana Buddhism and the one specifically responsible for helping to pull people out of hell, known as Di Zhang Wang Wu Sa in Chinese. Other so-called decisions are actually just, I think, contained in the ritual texts that are recited during a ritual, which are formalized. And for instance, Taoism has its own deity envisioned as a savior for hellbound souls, which is Tai Yi Jiuku Tianzun, or the heavenly worthy Tai Yi, which kind of means great oneness, who rescues people from bitterness and suffering. I've never had to ask Abbess Liu, would she particularly try to pray to that God in specific circumstances. Yeah, I haven't asked.
In certain strands of Tantric Buddhism, beyond initiation, there are also qualifying retreats that one can undertake in order to establish contact or a special sort of relationship with a deity. And once that's established, it can be in the form of, mantra recitations or various other kinds of practices. The practitioner is able to do various operations relating to that deity, whatever they may be, including ritual operations. Does anything like that to your knowledge, exist in Taoism, where relationship with a particular being or type of being is sought through some sort of qualifying practice, and then from that point one has a sort of hotline, if you want, to those powers.
Yeah, absolutely. That is generally referred to in religious Taoism as the obtaining of a register, a lu. And when one receives it is shou lu, receiving a register. And this is not an area of expertise for me, but I can say that Christopher Skipper's book, The Taoist Body, I believe touches on this quite a bit. And also Michael Saso's book, it might be The Teachings of Taoist Master Chuang or Huang. I read it a very, very long time ago, but both of these I don't think are too hard to find. And both of these scholars they did field work in Taiwan, maybe in the 1970s with living Taoist masters, and may have even to certain degrees learned how to perform ritual with them, especially Skipper. I'm not sure about Saso. So for people who are interested in this aspect of Taoist religious ritual practice, I would suggest their books as starting places.
Thank you very much. And one last question on this before we pivot to a couple of other points we'd agree to talk about. Another means of communicating with these sorts of other dimensional, extra dimensional, celestial beings and so on is the more shamanistic one, which involves a kind of temporary possession, a sort of instrumental possession for the purposes of giving oracles or indeed performing rituals and doing various other bits and pieces, shamanic things, and obtaining information, whatever the case may be. And so when one petitions a deity out there, that's one thing. When there's a kind of merging with the deity in a tantric sense, that's perhaps another thing. And then there's the indwelling of one's being by one of these celestial beings for shamanic purposes and so on. One sees that certainly in many forms of shamanism, I think all over the world, notably maybe in the Himalayas and Mongolian regions, but I think all over the place. So is that sort of thing on the continuum of the ways in which these beings are related to in Taoism? Or when that's involved, are we now a little bit outside of the scope of Taoism?
This is a bit controversial. I'll first answer as best I can from my own background of being taught a certain approach to Taoist practice by a certain small sample of teachers who I know, who are a tiny fraction of who's out there. But generally speaking, in the approach that I've been taught, it's like, never do that. Just don't. It's not fruitful. Even if it's a real, reliable, an actual xian or an actual bodhisattva comes to you, at best, that's just not internal alchemy. That would be separate from your internal alchemy of practice. Is that to say that anybody who's practicing internal alchemy could not also have another role as a medium for a legitimate xian? It's certainly not my place to say so. That said, the term Taoism, I mean, first of all, it's a tricky term because when we use it in English, are we referring to Daojia or Daojiao? Which, sort of loosely, you could call the first one the Taoist, literally, jia is like house, family, but it's sort of also like the school, the philosophical school, which therefore sometimes gets translated into English as philosophical Taoism, and then Daojiao, the Taoist teachings, and that's often translated as religious Taoism. But then there's also what in Taiwan is widely referred to as minjian zongjiao, or folk religion. But if you look at the actual lore and the deities on the shrines and the symbolism and even the self-identification of many folk religionists in Taiwan, it's very heavily steeped, if not almost entirely Taoist. And they may refer to themselves as Taoists. And there is not a tendency to become polemical about that among any other form of Taoist and point the finger and say you're disqualified or you're frauds or you're they may sort of mumble, oh, you're kind of on the wrong path, but it's very live and let live most of the time. But when I talk to other practitioners who are kind of encountering, these border realms where philosophy, solo, sort of you're totally responsible for your own cultivation sort of practices like Neidan, and more mediumistic or even shamanistic practices, you've got you're laying eyes on more than one of these paths because they're very tightly wrapped together in a small country like Taiwan. And people will comment like, how would you know that the being that you believe is communicating through you or even borrowing your body from time to time is who it, for lack of a better pronoun, says it is? And then that question is, very, very, very hard to answer. It's almost a rhetorical question. And it being an almost rhetorical question sort of implies that's why you leave this alone. That said, there are temples after temples after temples all over Taiwan, which has more temples than you could believe. I'm sure you could. You just came back from Nepal, but there's more temples here than 7-Elevens, and Taiwan has 7-Elevens like literally across the street from each other. I'm not joking. That's a common feature. So, and in those temples, one often finds people practicing what they describe as a form of Taoism sometimes that involves mediumship, actual possession. I think that might be the right word. Is possession? If one willingly allows a deity to borrow one's body, is that possession? Or it's here in Chinese, it's called shangji. You've let this thing come onto you, and you're. I guess it's a form of mediumship. Trance mediumship maybe would be the term. Speaking with gods, sometimes out loud. You don't, as a person such as myself, can't see if there is another being there answering or not, but it is for the benefit of those who are in the temple. The human in the conversation is speaking and waiting for an answer and then relaying it. All of this stuff. And actually, we just spoke about this over email and before we began recording. If you like, I could just read this quick paragraph from one of Michael Saso's articles that I think is very succinct.
Perhaps you could also mention who Michael Saso is.
So Michael Saso is probably either retired or professor emeritus of University of Hawaii, Manoa. I'm not sure which department, but he is also a Jesuit priest. Spent time in Taiwan, as I just mentioned, doing research into the Taoist canon, as well as basically anthropological religious studies research into living Taoism in Taiwan. And he may have also gone to China. I don't know all of his background. He wrote this book. I think it is called Taoist Master Zhuang, but spelled with a CH, now that I think about it. That is a very detailed explanation of his interactions with a Taoist in Taiwan in the 1970s, I think. And so he wrote a chapter for Sarah Coakley's Religion and the Body, and he wrote on Taoism. And this is from just the last page, a very short little segment. He says, so there are other forms of popular ritual found throughout Southeast and Southwest China that resemble or make use of Taoist texts and visualization, but are not truly Taoist, i.e., they are not kenotic or emptying in character, but cataphatic or filling with lesser spirits and local phenomena of nature. Though scholars and official Chinese sources often catalog these practices as, quote, Taoist, unquote, because they use Taoist texts, symbols, and icons, in fact, they are called by different names and have disparate effects on the body. Such practice can, but does not always, include what is called red head or red hat from Hongtou Taoism, the rituals of the Yao, Miao, Na Xi, Moso, and Bun Tibetan practices, and the Nakpa or Nawa rites of Tibetan conjurers in parts of Amdo. So I found this very interesting. And he, again, is a Jesuit. So he borrows these terms. I might get the pronunciation wrong, kenotic or kenotic, and then cataphatic, with kenotic being emptying in character and cataphatic filling with lesser spirits and local phenomena of nature. And what I have observed in temples in China and especially Taiwan, where there are far more temples to observe because there was never a cultural revolution here, is that these terms he borrowed from Christian theology are useful. And I would say the teacher I've spoken most about in our interviews, Abbess Liu, would be emptying in character. Absolutely. She's wu wei, non-doing, non-self, is absolutely the direction she's trying to push her students toward. Now, how emptying leads to whatever power she has, I am not qualified to say. But I can certainly say in terms of her approach to religious practice, there is no trance, mediumship, spiritual possession, spirit writing, talking to gods out loud, none of that. But I have encountered a lot of that in Taiwan. And I think the line between so-called folk Taoism and more religious orthodox Taoism is one of the ways you can draw it is there, using this terminology that Saso introduced.
Very interesting indeed. Very interesting indeed. Well, let's pivot, shall we, to discuss a couple of interesting recent experiences. Now, one of those is something happened in New York to you that you liaised with Abbess Liu about. What was that thing?
Yeah, how about I'll start with the Cataphatic story first, because it's chronologically earlier. And yeah, I just kind of feel compelled to tell the story this way. So when I was still in Chicago and becoming very interested in Taoism and Buddhism at the same time, I was interested in both from the get-go. I went to the Shambala Meditation Center a few times in Rogers Park, but I was living on the south side. It was really very far away. And it so happened that there were a few long-term Shambhala practitioners in Hyde Park. And they very kindly, upon finding out there was a growing interest in learning meditation in the community, sort of opened up their apartment on Thursday nights for a meditation session. And then after that, people would eat some cookies, drink some tea, and then pass around Zen Mind's Beginner's Mind and talk about meditation. It was great. It was very informal. And this couple, they saw that I was very interested in Taoism, and they said, "You've got to go meet this fellow in Homewood, Flossmoor, I guess a southwestern suburb of Chicago." And it turned out my other teacher, who I mentioned before, who was way up on the northern suburbs of Chicago, these two had crossed paths a long time ago as well. They knew of each other. And for the record, because somebody asked on YouTube, no, my teacher was not Wei Sun Liao. I've never met Wei Sun Liao. I was a different Taoist hermit outside of Chicago. Wei Sun Liao is not a hermit. Anyway, so I was very curious, and I got this fellow's phone number from this couple in Hyde Park. And I called him up, and he said, "Sure, take the Metro train down, and I'll pick you up at the station. And if you're interested in Taoism, we can chat." And he turned out to be an older white man, maybe in his 60s, maybe early 70s, spry, high energy dude, long hair, very cool guy. Picked me up at the station. And actually, I remember this very well because I really had not met any wizardly sorts of people at all. He was in the middle of a phone call on speakerphone, and a woman was consulting him for spiritual advice. And it was pretty weird. And, because he had me in the car, he very quickly told her that he picked someone up, and they finished their conversation. And he turned to me and he said, "Yeah, I'm trying to help her out because she's kind of a student of mine, and she lives next door to a cemetery, and she's got this problem where ghosts keep coming to her house at night and trying to rape her." And I'm just like, whoa, okay, this is a whole other world I'm walking into here. But after that, I went to his house, and it was very cool. He had this little sort of like ranch home, they call it in the Midwest, sort of one-story house. And he had the backyard set up in the most impressive sort of replica of a Kyoto garden that one could possibly accomplish in the Midwest. And had fantastic tea. He had a shrine in his house. He was living alone, quite a sparse furniture-wise, so that he could practice indoors and teach his students there. And we chatted for hours. And he had been in Taiwan in the 1980s, I believe, and was introduced to a Taoist master there. And I never, at this time, I knew so little, I never thought to ask his name, his lineage, his approach to Taoism. But I noticed that when this fellow, and I'm not saying his name because I can't, there's one trace of him on Google left. I believe he's still alive. I have no way to call him and ask him if it's appropriate to speak about him. And he's not a person who ever looked for attention. He never published a book, never had a website, never on TikTok. Pretty old school. Anyway, I can't ask for permission, but he did give me the opportunity to sort of ask about my own practice and health and stuff. And he kept referring, when he was responding at this point, he kept saying we. And I was a little bit strange. I thought maybe it was the royal we, to be honest. I didn't know. And then I went back and sought him out one more time, maybe a month after that. And I asked him, what do you mean by we? You keep saying we. And he said, oh, I think it was 3 spiritual helpers who are present with me, and I can communicate directly with them at all times. And when I need to help somebody with any sort of disease or spiritual affliction or problem, I will ask for these beings. They will begin giving me information. He wasn't speaking out loud asking them. He said they give him information and they're with him. And he made it very clear that this was a connection that came about through spiritual practice taught to him by his Taoist master in Taiwan, but also the master himself facilitated these connections in ways that I can't explain how. But he did also, he pointed to the Buddha statue he had. Again, this syncretism is extremely common, especially in Taiwanese Taoism. And he said also, my teacher did quite a lot of work on that Buddha statue. It was a lying sort of Buddha statue, like you maybe see in Thailand. It may have even been from Thailand because it looked like it was in that style. And he said that my teacher did a lot of work on it. That statue is no different than Buddha. And so on that day, I mean, I was very, I had a lot of nerve in a way. I would keep this guy talking for hours. He'd just keep making tea. He didn't ask for any money. I remember, I think I left $20 on his shrine when I left, but I was just full of questions and thirsty. And okay, if this guy's gonna humor me, then I'll keep going. But eventually it got to the point, he's like, all right, let's wrap it up, kid. Do you have any last thing you need to ask? And I'll take you back to the train station. And I did at that point. I had a close friend, and he had confessed to me that he had done a truly terrible thing, a harmful thing to another person. And when he confessed this to me, he did not brag. He felt extremely guilty about it. And it was a violent thing. And he had done it to somebody who was not directly connected to my friendship group and perhaps in secrecy, so nobody knew. But he was shaking when he confessed this to me, this act of harm. And I did my best as a very unwise young man that I was at that time to sort of give him counsel how he might go about clearing his conscience. And anyway, this person remained in my life, but I became a little bit scared, to be honest. And I had more than one friend at that point in time, and I myself had committed acts of violence, not to the degree that he was confessing, but I had friends who were pretty rough. And, I just felt a little bit nervous in his presence. Like this was a certain ante had been upped in terms of people that I was hanging out with. And I didn't feel entirely safe around him. And so since this fellow that I was speaking to in Homewood Flossmoor, whichever one it was, he told me he had this ability to obtain information from his spiritual helpers that had become a part of his life because of Taoist practice in Taiwan. I said, may I ask, is it possible for you to ascertain whether or not my friend actually did the thing he said he did? And if so, am I in danger? And the man, he was quite a serious fellow. He wasn't like dour or solemn, but he was pretty serious. And he said, sure, okay. And he seemed to take it in and nodded slowly. And he was seated on a wooden chair with arms, like a very simple sort of old-fashioned kitchen chair, but a nice one with arms. And I was also seated on a wooden chair. And between us was just a small table that he had his tea set on. And then he closed his eyes. And it's daytime, light is flooding in. It was maybe 3 in the afternoon or something like that, a Chicago summer day. And the moment he closed his eyes, and I've never seen anything like this since, I felt like a static electricity feeling come over me, like my hair on my body felt like it was standing up, that sort of feeling. I don't know if it actually was or not. And the lights in all the lights in his house began to flicker dramatically, and not coordinated with each other. It was like something out of a ghost movie. I'm always the sort of person who likes to add a little skeptical question mark. I mentioned that his wooden chair had arms. Was there a little switch attached under it for magical effect for these moments where you need to impress the people who come with questions? I don't know. And I have no horse in any race. But that went on for a hot minute, maybe 35, 45 seconds or something like that. And then he opened his eyes and leaned forward. And he had a different look. He just had this, it was impressive. He was in full wizard mode. And I'm like, what has just happened? And he's looking at me with kind of fierce eyes, not threatening or angry or anything, but just like, like lion eyes. And I'm like, so did he do it? And he's like, don't ask that question. And I was like, what? It's like, you think you haven't done anything like that before? And I'm like, I definitely haven't. He's like, in this life, you think any of us on this earth haven't killed, haven't raped, haven't done whatever crime you can imagine? Do you think any of us doesn't carry that karma? Any of us? Whether it was in this life or the last, we've all got this sort of karma. All of us. And it was like, whoa. I was like, damn, I didn't grow up in religion at all. So I wasn't used to getting any fire and brimstone at all. I was like, oh, God, this is new to me. And then he said, he softened. And I said, okay, well, I kind of asked just because I'm not curious idly. I'm a little bit nervous around him. And he said, whether or not your friend did it is not relevant to you, and it is not for me to tell you, and I am not going to. What is important for you to know is that in his mind, he has done this thing. He believes it, that it is real. And yes, I believe you should keep a distance from this young man, this friend of yours. Not like you should run away from this person and never have this person interact with you, but just maintain a healthy arm's length. Don't get dragged too far into this person's their path, their behaviors. Let them walk theirs, you walk yours. And he specifically said, I think you may have a somewhat addictive personality, and therefore it could be possible for you to kind of get sucked in. I didn't ask for much detail, but I think one can get addicted to wild behaviors. I certainly was at times in my life. I think he was maybe intimating something like that. And it wasn't hard advice to follow because I was already extricating myself from a lot of these things. So I thanked him. He drove me back to the metro station, and I took it back and ended up back in Hyde Park, where I was living at the time in Chicago. And that was that. And I actually never spoke to him again. And yeah, but I wanted to bring that up because I would say that using this terminology that Michael Saso introduces in that chapter in Sarah Coakley's book, that this would seem to be what he refers to as the cataphatic side of Taoism. This man openly acknowledges that he is receiving messages and sort of is accompanied permanently by three spiritual helpers, and that the works that he is able to undertake are facilitated, and I perhaps you could say empowered, by these beings, including if what I just described with the flickering lights and the maybe a moment of astral travel or consulting some records or whatever, that I think he would say is all facilitated by his helpers or teachers. And that sort of thing is not really at all a part of Quanzhen Taoism, or I think even Zheng Yi, the much more ritual-based Taoism. I've been present for a very, very long and complicated Zheng Yi ritual in Taiwan, and it's an incredible, absolutely unbelievable display of nonstop, hour after hour of memorized chanting with extraordinarily complex, memorized footwork and almost like martial dance moves involving fire and weapons. And certainly no room for randomness, and certainly a human endeavor, in the sense that these men that I witnessed had all gone through long apprenticeships and long periods of arduous learning and strengthening themselves to be able to have the stamina to be able to do this. I mean, Taiwan is hot and humid. It's mind-blowing. It's very different than okay, you're going to come to me for help and I'm going to directly engage with the spiritual world in some way or another. But again, regardless of whether we call it folk religion, folk Taoism, or just another type of Taoism, it's here for sure. And it certainly was and is still, though with a degree of secrecy and underground presence in China. 2017, I finished Chinese medicine school, and I was back in the US, having left Beijing, and I was facing the difficult reality that I learned how to become very, very good at taking tests and memorizing enormous quantities of information, because that's what Chinese university asks of you, but I had very little actual clinical experience as a medical intern, because that is not what Chinese higher education offers. And I was, at that point, I had not yet decided to walk away from the medical profession or alternative medical profession, if you will. And I had briefly met an interesting fellow who in Beijing, a Chinese man, claimed to have learned a form of massage that was used in the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of China's forbidden siddhi, to treat members of the imperial family, which therefore meant that it had to be very effective, very painless, very gentle, and very low to no risk, because you accidentally crack someone's neck chiropractically and it's the emperor and he doesn't like the way you did it and you're going to lose your neck and what's on top of it. So I was able to observe at his home where he saw patients, but he wasn't really willing to teach me unless I paid him a lot of money for a long time. And I didn't have time or money that I wanted to give him. I was ready to leave Beijing. But I found out, I knew already about myofascial release, and I had been treated in the US by a myofascial release practitioner in Connecticut many years earlier. And observing that man work, I really felt like, you know, what he's doing looks an awful lot like myofascial release, the gentle form of myofascial release. And to this day, I think it stands to reason. for two reasons. One, human bodies are very similar all over the world, even though we do get caught up on the differences. Most of us are arm, leg, a leg, arm, head, as the 5%ers say. And, you know, disease, a stiff neck, I'm pretty sure for an Indian guy, for a Peruvian guy, for a wherever guy, a stiff neck is the same pain in the neck, right? So I think very similar treatment approaches could develop spontaneously in other parts of the world. And so I began when I was back in the US trying to see if I could learn myofascial release, and I came across the website of John Barnes, who is arguably one of the most important, if not the most important, contributors to myofascial release. Really incredible teacher, I have to say. I believe he's still alive. I don't know if he's teaching. He'd be in his 90s now. He was 86 and teaching when I went to his courses in New York City. I signed up for a 3-day course, not knowing what to expect. It was taught in a hotel ballroom in Manhattan, and it was so good in terms of theory and practice, and lots of hands-on technique practice with people, that I immediately signed up for 2 more courses, because he was in New York for 3-day courses, which, because he travels around, makes a lot of sense. And in the second 3-day course, he spent a good amount of time talking about the relationship between the mind and being a healer of any type, being in the role of providing treatment, providing, or at least attempting to provide healing for a person who has sought you out as a patient, as a sufferer. And the presence you maintain, also the presence of mind you must maintain. Not to reject a person, not to become sexually enamored, infatuated with a person, not to become overly emotional if they aren't treating you as politely as you would like. All the things you can imagine in a clinic. There's so much intimacy to maintain equipoise, closeness, and yet distance at the same time. And he introduced a fantastic activity in which we were to sort of get a quick taste for what he was explaining theoretically. And there were about 100 students there. John Barnes' classes are very popular. And he told us, pick anybody as your partner. The only rule is it's somebody you've never met before, which was in a room of 100 people in New York, very easy. I turned to the woman next to me, and we did not know each other. And immediately we found out we had lived like walking distance from each other in Chicago long ago. But anyway, he has us first, the first exercise is to just turn our chairs to be facing very close, knees almost touching, and to just maintain unbroken eye contact for, I estimate about 5 minutes, which is a very long time to be staring into a person's eyes, and requires a lot of trust and willingness to plunge into incredible intimacy. And it was intense. Looking around the room, you know, some people were shaking, some people were having emotional reactions. And anyway, after each of these, we break briefly. You could raise your hands, ask a question, and then the next instruction. So the next one was just the same as the first one, except one person is standing above the other, looking down into their eyes, and the other is looking up into their eyes. No further instruction, 5 minutes or so, unbroken eye contact, then switch. Now people reported, oh, some of them felt it dug up childhood memories of being yelled at by teachers and parents and all sorts of stuff, mostly emotional. And again, some people were crying or struggling to not spontaneously move. That section of the practice finished. And then we were asked to sit back down again. And now we would just have the thought, we would take turns. One of us would decide amongst ourselves, will first be the healer. We would sit there looking eye to eye with this thought, both of you know who is the healer, and the other one is, I am the patient. I'm receiving healing from this person who's giving it. But otherwise, it's just the same as the first exercise. And then you switch. And you just, I must say, it's a profound thing. Just that one thought, I am the healer, she's the patient. Now she's the healer, I'm the patient. It's an incredible exercise in seeing the power of a single thought to change a dynamic between human beings instantaneously. And anyway, everybody then shared once again, and then finally he said, okay, the last move, or the last sort of posture arrangement I want you to do is stand up, and for the first time, you will have physical contact. Stand face to face, look into the eyes of the other person, and put your hands up like this, and all 10 fingertips will be touching between the two people. And then just maintain the eye contact until we close the practice, and allow yourself to feel what arises. And we were standing at the edge of this crowd of 100-something people, and it was quite amazing to watch that people's reactions were extremely different. Some people, the sexual tension between them was on the point of a volcanic eruption, and you almost wanted to tell them to get a room upstairs. Others were having outbursts, because in John Barnes' teaching, like, people go into spontaneous states sometimes, and others are. Anyway, it was quite wild and unexpected. But she and I don't think either of us were forcing this. We're just motionless for the entire span of time that lasted, and it was extremely intense, and it felt quite magical, but just in a very down-to-earth, plain, subtle way of, wow, sharing this with this human is beautiful, and so unexpectedly intense, and yet feels right. It wasn't an uncomfortable intensity. So we sat down. Everybody who wanted to raise their hand and share something did, and that was that. And maybe there was a few more exercises for the rest of the day. And then around 5 p.m. class ends, and she came over and sought me out. And she said, oh, Mattias, before you leave, I wanted to ask you, did you feel anything special when we were doing that? And I said, well, kind of what I just described to you about these feelings of intimacy, and I said I felt that we were really sharing something, and it was quite profound, and I felt very grateful. She said, yeah, but did you feel anything else? And I was like, well, I guess I felt sort of inner peace and this incredible energy exchange between us. She's like, yeah, but anything else? And I just kept coming up with answers like this because it's honest, and I thought that's what she was kind of digging for. And then finally she said, okay, I'm going to ask you something weird. Let me ask you, did you not feel or see a purple ball of light or energy emerge from your throat, rise up to my eye level, split into 2 smaller circular balls of energy, and then go into my eyes? And I'm just like, no. She's like, you're sure you didn't see that? I'm like, very, you know what I mean? Like, come on. That's not one of those things you can either sort of half see. It's like, no, I didn't see any purple ball of light. And I didn't write her off. I felt, I could tell that she was speaking to me from vulnerability and sincerity and genuine curiosity. And I said, I'm so sorry. I don't want to deceive you. I saw and felt nothing special like that. And she said, oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to check because I saw that and it was so real. And okay, thank you. And I genuinely thanked her, and we parted ways. I went back to my Airbnb. The next day, it's a very big classroom, and we were not sitting anywhere near each other, and we didn't partner for any activities. We didn't see each other at lunchtime, no interaction. And on the 3rd and final day of the course, John Barnes typically leave a longer question and answer or sharing session, maybe as much as an hour and a half, for people to ask whatever they would like to ask. And at some point during this, she stood up and she began to tell her story. She said she has been legally blind since she was a small girl, which means that she has never not worn incredibly thick lensed glasses. And with them, of course, she can navigate the world, but she, with the glasses off, is legally blind, she said. And therefore, she has never seen her face without these glasses on. But she has always prayed and prayed and prayed that she would be healed, and has known in her heart that eventually she would have a healing. And she said that night when she was back at her hotel room, when she had already brushed her teeth and showered and everything and gotten into bed and taken off her glasses, the light was still on in the hotel room, and she looked across the room into the mirror, and she saw her own face clearly, and she was shocked because her glasses were off. And immediately she said to herself, this can't be real. And she turned off the light with the switches next to the bed, as they are in hotels, and went to bed, went to sleep. And then she continued the story and said the next morning she woke up, the sun's coming in through the windows, through the curtains. She sits up, and again she looks across the room, and she sees her face clearly in the mirror with no glasses on. And at this point, she realizes this is not what happened the night before, was not a fantasy. She's now seeing her face without visual correction. And she's telling this story, and she's racked with emotion. By the time she's finishing the story, she's crying and, overwhelmed with emotion, as this story she was telling obviously was extremely real to her. And I believe it. I believe it. I felt no reason to see her as a fraud at that moment. And I have more to say about this story, why I believe it. I don't know if we interacted again. We may have just said goodbyes, and that was it. I've never had another contact with this person. So I stayed for another 3-day course after that in New York. She was not there. She had gone back to Chicago, I guess. And then I went home. I was staying with my parents, who at the time were living outside of New Haven. And I told my mother this story, and she's just kind of like, okay, that's cool. My mom is not a witch or she has her spirituality for sure, but she's not into this hippie trippy stuff that I am. But she's not closed-minded to it either. And if I want to tell her one of my many weird stories, as she's heard plenty, she'll generally listen. And so she's like, that's a very interesting story. Okay, that's about that. And then I began in the days that followed to work on my mother's knee, and she had some other injuries from actually fascial damage after surgery. And I began to practice on her. And we had a massage table in the basement. And after one of the sessions, my mother says to me, I just wanted to tell you, as you were working, it was so beautiful, this purple light that gathered on the ceiling. And my immediate reaction was just, okay, that's because I told my mom this story, right? I planted that seed. This is I don't know what you call this, suggestion, right? This is the power of suggestion in action. And I'm sorry, I just told this story a little bit out of order. There was a break of a couple of days between the second and third class that John Barnes taught. New Haven is very close to New York. I went back to New Haven for a couple of, maybe a night, stayed at home, and then went back to New York after that. So this took place in between the second and third course. Then I went back to New York City because I had to find a new Airbnb because I kept adding new courses that I wanted to take with John Barnes. So now I ended up very far from Manhattan in a Airbnb in Flushing, Queens. And I happened to have the landlady who was running the Airbnb, she was very racist. And she, every day after dinner, wanted to give me a glass of wine and tell me what she thought of Black people. And I was just like, I don't think what you think about Black people. And she was just intent on talking about it. So the first night, I was just like, I'm going to make it a practice, finish my dinner, and get out of this house and go for a walk. And on the second night, I had my dinner, chatted with her a little bit. She got rolling on the race stuff. And I was like, I'm out. I got to go take my walk. And I'm walking down the street in Flushing, Queens on a residential neighborhood block at night. And I see in the sky above me an enormous purple cloud, semi-transparent energy cloud floating above Flushing, Queens. And I'm just like, no. This is not there. This is BS. Now I've auto-suggested myself. Something's wrong with my eyes, whatever. I'm not seeing this purple thing. I walk under a tree, and as I am under this tree, which had all its leaves on it, summertime or early autumn, I am unable to see the sky. Now the purple thing disappears, and I'm like, tell myself, after I come out from under this tree, that light is not going to be there. And lo and behold, the purple light is still there hovering in the sky, and it remains there for another maybe minute or or so, and then it gradually just dims or becomes, just the light fades until there's nothing. It's just regular sky. And then my mind begins to race with all kinds of like, well, there must be some sort of like a store under there with a purple light on its sign or something. And then I'm thinking, yeah, but like McDonald's have big red and yellow signs. I've never seen a red cloud in the sky. And I'm just kind of confused. So like, what is this? And anyway, I couldn't get an answer. But I decided I would never again tell anybody about this purple light if I was going to do myofascial release on them. And I just kept the story to myself after that, mostly, because I just felt like the story is so intense. It clearly suggested me and suggested my mother into, you know, that so deeply that we began to delude ourselves. And a few months pass, quite a few months, and that's when I first moved to Taiwan. Now it's early 2018, and I met a friend of a friend who had studied Chinese medicine at one of my good friends' academies in Shanghai. And now she's Taiwanese, and she had moved back to Taiwan, and we got to know each other a little bit. And she was working with acupuncture. I was now doing mostly body work, a mix of Chinese medicine stuff that I learned and myofascial release, which was filling in a lot of gaps for me. And so one day we offered to just exchange practice on each other. She had a knee problem. And I told her nothing of everything I just told you. And I finish, and she sits up and says, I have to tell you something. I just kept seeing the most beautiful purple light the whole time you were working. It was just extraordinary. And at that point, I'm just like, okay, that's uncanny. That's very, very uncanny. And why is it a purple light? Just like the Taoists love purple light. But actually, as I've listened to the odd podcast from other spiritual traditions, it is a color that shows up. It shows up in autobiography of a yogi when one of the people he speaks about there disappears when he dies in a flash of purple light. I've heard people with out-of-body experiences who believe that they are going to higher realms talk about the purple light. Anyway, I don't need to make a huge purple light speculation, but it stuck out in my mind that is a color that Taoists associate with higher spiritual realization. And I did not think that this meant that I was spiritually realized. I also did not think that I was shooting purple light out. I was really quite mystified about it. Not long after that, I went and visited China from Taiwan, and I saw Abbess Liu, and I was quite excited to tell her this whole story. And I was at least hoping I would get some sort of like, well, this is a sign that you've made, and made some progress or whatever. And she heard me out, and then she's like, you definitely shouldn't. Don't make a big deal about that. Don't even think about it. I'm like, well, why not? Well, isn't purple light magical? When Lao Tzu came and passed the mountains and Guan Yin got him to stay and write the Tao Te Ching, isn't that because he saw a big purple light on the horizon and he knew a sage was coming? I mean, I didn't say that directly, but this is kind of my internal monologue. She's like, it's meaningless. All those sort of miraculous healings and things you're describing with this guy in New York, he's probably just got some sort of spirit attached to him and it helps him heal. That's probably it. And that's not the cultivation we're doing. Like that's good for him, but you don't know that entity and it's not yours. And indeed, the purple light thing has never repeated. Whatever happened may indeed, as Abbess Liu diagnosed, have just sort of been a part of John Barnes's path, his affinities. If there is a heavenly realm interacting with ours, then maybe there is some divine being who has chosen to teach him. And funny enough, after Abbess Liu splashed cold water on me, so to speak, much later, I started reading John Barnes' autobiography, which I had bought in New York, but I had never gone through it. And he, in fact, speaks in his autobiography very openly that he learned myofascial release initially because he was severely injured, and nothing that he knew from his physical therapy training at Northwestern University in the 1970s could help him. And he was so despondent and in so much awful chronic pain that he was contemplating suicide when one day a voice began speaking to him in his ear and told him how to begin manipulating his own body to cure himself. And he says it is from that myofascial release developed, which, and it's in his autobiography, it's on Amazon. It may well be that Abbess Liu either just has seen so much that she just figured it was that way, or maybe Abbess Liu has the ability to sense these things. I don't know. But here we see returning to Michael Saso's, the terms he borrowed from Christian theology, a kenotic approach to Taoism, where you come to your teacher with these kinds of stories and you kind of want at least a pat on the head, or maybe a new Jedi stripe on your cloak. But no, it's just, no, dude, that's not you. That's not even really the way. And not to disparage the wonderful work that John Barnes does, which I am sure he has saved lives, because just think of how many people have died due to the opioid epidemic, which so many people get sucked into because of chronic pain, right? I mean, his work is important, and it's tremendously meritorious. But not everything that is tremendously meritorious is the same as awakening. And that is the point that Abbess Liu tries to drive home in her approach to Taoism, which, of course, some people listening may think, oh, it sounds like there's a lot in common with Chan, with Zen, to which Abbess Liu would say, absolutely. Zen, Chan, Tao, Lao Tzu's teachings are one. And a final funny little thought on this that just popped into my head, I was telling you. That guy in Beijing I met, who said he was doing the imperial palace form of massage, he also told me way back when that much of what he learned came from an old teacher who had received, a living man who had received transmission in his family, who were originally involved in the imperial era in this sort of healing in the Forbidden City. And this man had taught him when he was a boy, because that man saw how filially pious he was in trying to help his mother with her chronic pain condition. But also, the most important teachings he was receiving were from a disembodied teacher who was visiting him in dreams and telling him how to heal people using body work. So, as I was mulling over a little bit earlier, how very similar healing approaches, modalities can develop in very disparate, far-flung geographical regions and eras in time. Maybe it's the same guy or the same divine being talking to both of them. You never know. Yeah, so that's that story.
Wow, that's quite a thought. That closing thought, that's quite a thought indeed. Goodness me. Well, thank you for talking about these various subjects and sharing these stories. It's very fascinating indeed. And I wonder, by way of closing, if I might ask you, what's your current, I suppose, personal position on this realm of deities and powers and so on, with the various experiences you've had, positive and negative, certainly some negative ones, as you explained in the last episode. What's your current relationship to it? You said that sometimes the hierarchies of heaven bore you a little, but on the other hand, you've had many strange experiences and mysterious encounters. Where are you now with it all, just in terms of your own personal disposition?
I would use two terms from Chinese to respond to that. One of them, I think, is a Confucian term, and it may even have come from a comment Confucius is meant to have made about the spirit realm, but I might be wrong about that. But it is 敬而远之. It's a Chengyu, and it's 4 characters, which mean respectfully remaining at a distance from this. And which I mean to say, I don't go seeking this stuff out. I mean, some people may slap themselves on the thigh the moment they hear that. And this guy, all he does is get on podcasts and talk about spirits and goblins and gods. And now he's trying to tell us he's not into this stuff. And to those people, I raise my tea mug and say, fair point. But really, I don't go looking for this stuff. As I said that in the last episode, I don't want to be like brushing my teeth, pooping in the bathroom, and having a goblin or a god trying to talk to me. I want to just poop in peace, bro, and everything else. The other thing is, in practice, though Abbess Liu has never said, I am teaching you the Taoist practice of sitting and forgetting from 坐忘, which is a term that appeared in the Zhuangzi, which is a very, very old text, and then was in the Tang Dynasty by a Shangqing, highest clarity Taoist, Sima Chengzhen, wrote a book expanding upon, or a treatise expanding upon what it means to sit and forget as a meditation practice, called the 坐忘论, which I know people could find it in English. It's been translated. What does it mean to sit and forget? To me, it's just kind of, as I sit to practice seated meditation, as I have been taught by Abbess Liu and another teacher I mentioned in Taiwan who has a very similar approach, it's just doing nothing. It's just, yeah, man, that's really all you can say. And if I find myself thinking, I just give it sky-like space, and let it be. And then very quickly, those thoughts nowadays, and it took years and years and years for it to become like this, tend to just kind of evaporate. Not push them away, not cling to them, not try to analyze them, not try to stop them, just give them all the space they need. Same with emotions. And actually, I've taken courses with the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Tsoknyi Rinpoche, who's coming to Taiwan again in a couple of days. Actually, I'll take more classes with him in the body as well. His subtle body teachings, I find, mesh extremely nicely with the Taoist teachings I've received. And so as my actual practice, as much as I set aside time to do it, it's just so simple and boring. And all I can say is, so far, so good. No being, at least that I have sensed or seen or felt or heard whispering in my ear, has come to join those sessions. There may be much happening in the unseen universe that I am blissfully unaware of. But that is, I guess you could say, I have become quite content and satisfied with the approach that Saso refers to as kenotic in his simplified breakdown. But also, you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I mean, I saw a ghost last year because a friend of mine who's very, very into spiritualism brought a weird candle that she was helping somebody to sell on her Instagram page to the place I was staying in on a small island off the coast of southern Taiwan called Xiaoliuqiu, and said, "Would you like to try this candle? It's supposed to open us up to the 7th dimension." I was like, okay, sure. So we lit the candle and sat in the room and smelled the fumes, which had nice perfumes and herbs, and apparently there were some minerals in the wax. And I felt like a pleasant buzzing, and saw some colors with my eyes closed. Who knows what was in that candle? And that night, riding a motorbike on the island, I saw a disembodied, half transparent human, partial human body, partially transparent, walking in front of my motorbike as I was riding. And the next day I was like, I am not gonna play with that candle anymore, because that is enough for me. Yeah.
Mattias Daly, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.